Welcome back. You're watching Africa Speaks. We continue with our conversation centered on the state of tourism in the two East African countries, Kenya and Uganda, who neighbor each other. And just before we started this conversation, I gave you statistics that reported Uganda contributed 12% of total arrivals to Kenya in 2022, coming in second. My guest illustrated that in Uganda, Kenya comes first in terms of contributions in the tourism sector. I'm joined by Ambassador Paul Mukumbia, who is the Ugandan consulate to Mombasa in Kenya, basically in charge of the 6 counties in Mombasa, and looking for ways in which to boost the tourism in those counties between his country and the coastal region. So, Ambassador, right before the break, we were deliberating about a lot, but I'd like us to focus specifically on matters to do with promoting local tourism. And before the break, I illustrated how, and I'm sure you've heard of this, Tembea Kenya, Buy Kenya, Build Kenya. At times, we try and tap into the potential of the population within our borders to boost the tourism numbers. And this came with the COVID-19, and it definitely showed the inconsistencies around relying on foreigners. So what are we doing in terms of Kenya and Uganda to boost the local numbers of tourists, so we don't necessarily have to rely on the Europeans, the pensioners who come into the country? We can tap into the 50+ million people who are in Kenya. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the numbers already speak for themselves. That's why we are even putting more focus on this.
Yeah.
But even in Uganda, we are promoting domestic tourism.
Okay.
And in one of the local languages, it is called Okulambula. That is to tour. Okulambula is to tour.
Okay.
And the Ministry of Tourism has come up with a program to tour all the parts of Uganda. They focus on one part of the country after the other, and so many of them led by a whole Minister of State in charge of tourism. They've been doing that. But beyond the domestic, we also know that, for example, in Uganda, domestic means East Africa. So much so that, for example, for a Kenyan to go and to get a gorilla permit, it costs about $80. Whereas for a foreigner, it costs $700.
Okay.
So you can, and even the Ugandan pays the same 250 Uganda shillings, which is about $80.
Okay.
So you can see that we are really trying to avoid over-relying on foreigners.
Okay.
Foreigners, in this case, coming from outside East Africa. So this is a very big point that we are doing to make sure that all East Africans are considered as domestic tourists, and they are treated as such, even in accessing the parks, in paying for the permits, even in the accommodation facilities.
All right.
So this is a very big point that we are promoting. But also, in addition to that, which has existed for many years, we know that for a Ugandan to travel to Kenya, previously it was just a passport or even a simple travel document, not necessarily a passport, and vice versa, even a Kenyan. But recently, in the recent years, with the Northern Corridor integration projects, which were promoted by the presidents of Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and later joined by South Sudan, one can travel on an identity card, a national identity card, amongst Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda, just a national identity card. And we don't require visas to visit one another's country. So this is another effort that was introduced by the region to promote domestic tourism, so that how tedious it is in many of our countries to get a passport.
Yes.
But it becomes much easier to get when you already have a national ID. In Uganda, we are catching up in acquiring national IDs. Almost every Ugandan now has a national ID. But Kenya was there before us, I think. They took the issuance of national IDs. So this makes it much easier to promote domestic tourism. But we also know that one can get onto a bus, one can drive, one can get onto SGR, for example, from the coast up to Nairobi.
Yes.
And there are plans to take the SGR up to Uganda. So all these make traveling much easier. The last thing which I think our countries need to work on is the cost of air travel, because the cost of air travel is still very high and prohibitive. But if we can also domesticate air travel so that it becomes much more easier for people to travel by air, then we shall again grow the numbers. So all these are initiatives that have been undertaken by our governments and the private sector to promote domestic tourism. And in this case, as I've said, domestic tourism refers to visits within the East African Community member states.
Okay, let's talk about briefly EAC integration, because in some instances, these East African countries find themselves sharing certain resources that can definitely contribute to the tourism sector. And perhaps, speaking of Lake Victoria, how can we tap into such resources that we share in order to boost our tourism numbers? What are we doing in order to boost the numbers?
I'm happy you mentioned Lake Victoria, because this is a resource that relies largely underutilized, if at all, to promote tourism. We are just getting fish there. You know, at one point we were quarreling about the fish in Mijingo, but we agreed that the Kenyans can eat the fish and we keep the... But that's on a light note. On a light note. But on a serious note, I think and I've been, for example, trying to promote tourism on Lake Victoria. And I've been telling some of potential investors that, for example, if an investor got a mid to high-end cruise and put it on Lake Victoria to be sailing, for example, between Port Bell in Uganda, Kisumu in Kenya, maybe Mwanza in Tanzania, you can't imagine how much we would really exploit that. Because, you know, East Africans and even Ugandans in particular, we love partying. And you can imagine if somebody had such a cruise on Lake Victoria, maybe sailing out on a Thursday and returning on a Sunday evening. Yes. And people are there, are dancing and drinking and doing what? It would really do wonders. And if we put up such a facility, other infrastructure will follow. The hotels and lodges will follow, and many other supportive infrastructure to the tourism sector. So really, we need to work together to promote tourism on Lake Victoria. It's a resource that we have really not taken very full advantage of. Okay, so as we finalize, we're having a conversation in the backdrop of the Africa Climate Summit. And we definitely saw various heads of state, government representatives, and stakeholders pull their weight in terms of making Africa's decision. The Nairobi Declaration was made in terms of charting the way forward around matters climate change. And just hearing from what you were saying, Uganda partly relies on natural resources for the tourism sector. You were talking about chimpanzees, gorillas, and in one or the other, they will be affected with the adverse effects of climate change. So, Ambassador, I'd like your take on the just concluded Africa Climate Summit. What are we doing enough generally as East African countries to combat the effects of climate change? I mean, Kenya just had one of the worst droughts in over 40 years, and this definitely caused a strain in the vegetation and you name it, equally the wild natural resources we have. So on your part, what do you think needs to be done to ensure we get this collective goal in terms of combating climate change? Indeed, as you rightly say, most of our tourism sites are in what we call national parks. And we all saw what happened during the drought in Kenya. We saw many animals, carcasses, lying dead in the parks. And indeed, there's what we call sustainable tourism. And there is a Kenyan lady who is famous, I think she's called Judy Kefa, who is very famous for promoting sustainable tourism. Okay. I think all countries in the region need to ensure that we promote tourism in a sustainable way. For example, in Uganda, the mountain gorillas that we have, we limit the number of permits that are issued out. Although it's a very big resource for us, we don't just sell as many permits as may be required, because we want to exploit this resource in a sustainable way. We have to ensure that the national parks are not encroached on by human settlements, so that the animals at the end of the day and other creatures out there, they don't run away from, or we don't encroach on their natural habitats. But also to ensure that, for example, we provide water. For example, in these, what we saw in Kenya was really unfortunate. But how can we ensure that governments who are supposed to really protect these parks ensure that maybe in such adverse effects, like when there's no water, that we also make sure that it is sustainable, maybe by providing water, so that the nature is preserved. So indeed, it's true, President Ruto, not only President Ruto, but all our leaders in the region are playing a key role in promoting, in preventing the adverse effects of climate change, in promoting sustainable tourism. But it is not only governments that should promote or work against the adverse effects of climate change. All of us have a responsibility and a role to play. But before I end, if you may permit
briefly, yes.
I really have to talk about another conference that we are organizing in Diani this year in November, the second conference, because we agreed this conference is annual. We have a media launch in Diani next Tuesday, where we are going to publicize it. I'm sure KTN will cover us. So this year again in Diani in November from 13th and 14th, we have another second conference there. And after the conference, again, excursions at the coast, and finally, again, a farm trip to Uganda. We want to expose as many tourism stakeholders to these products, so that, as I said earlier, they promote and sell products that they have seen and experienced. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. I don't know how you say thank you in Uganda.
In one of my local language says webale.
Webale.
Yes.
Well, webale. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for hosting me.
Okay, so we're having a conversation on matters tourism sector. It was a pleasure to host Ambassador Paul Mukumbia, who's the Ugandan consulate to Mombasa, Kenya, just deliberating on areas we can improve in terms of the collaborative approach between these two countries in boosting the tourism numbers. My name is Jesse Rogers. Thank you so much for watching Africa Speaks. Enjoy the rest of your viewing.